It's the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIBC.
Closing. Welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, now nationally syndicated. There are a lot of fine folks over at Consumer Choice. One of the best is Bill Wirtz. Now, Bill Wirtz can mean a lot of things out there in the wide world. It can mean a very wacky music and video producer, or one of the finer industrial and economic policy minds of our time. And we brought that one on because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has joined the Trump campaign, and they're doing a lot of work together, and there's a lot of enthusiasm. Oh man, he's going to come in with a big sledgehammer and do all of this amazing regulatory reform. Well, Stephen Kent, who is normally on with us for What You Watchin' when he's not absolutely crushing it in a council election in Virginia, co-wrote an article with Bill Wirtz here for the American Spectator, was it?
That's correct.
Absolutely. On why maybe before you get out your popcorn, your sparklers, and your fireworks for the excitement of RFK, like a bull in the china shop of regulatory reform, well, might want to put a little bit of a pin in that one. Bill, thanks for hopping on with us.
Thank you for having me, Tony. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's quite an interesting one, because when RFK talked about who he was considering endorsing, he actually said that he was considering both campaigns. So he really looked at what is the biggest benefit here for me. And RFK, he has one thing that he has always regretted in his career that he never got, and that was being head of the EPA. And I think now he thinks that this is his best shot at getting there. Now, a lot of people cheer for RFK because he doesn't have many good things to say about the Biden administration and about Kamala Harris, and I can understand where they're coming from. But the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend.
I was going to jump in with that as soon as you took a breath and you beat me to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those classics, right? And the thing is that if you actually compare RFK and Trump on policy, because I mean, with Donald Trump, we do have an experience with actual 4 years as president. And when he appointed Scott Pruitt as head of the EPA, Scott Pruitt actually got a lot of deregulation to fix a lot of the damage that had been done under the Obama years. So, for instance, reauthorizing essentially the use of the herbicide atrazine, the thing that RFK thinks makes the frogs gay. So it's a lot of these conspiracy theories that RFK brings to the table that would be incredibly damaging to American agriculture. I think conservatives that care about agriculture, maybe if you politically align on some of the things that RFK says and the way he comes across, I can understand that. But I think on policy, letting people like this anywhere near the halls of power would be very damaging.
And that's a concern that has popped into my mind with regard of the rise of the populism movement, because there's a lot of good things that have come out of the populism movement. No, I'm sorry, the college that you went to does not automatically entitle you to getting a free pass on never being criticized again. That kind of anti-establishmentarianism, just being elite for the sake of elitism, is not a good thing. That's been a good part of the populism movement. Also, a lot of institutions that have started using their power for ill and not for good, some of them kind of a century into it, not exactly starting. Sorry, when I think of the Federal Reserve, for instance. But just because there are some good things that have come out of the populism movement doesn't mean that all of a sudden anything a populist gets up there and rants is good policy. And RFK Jr. is a perfect example of this. And I whenever he gets out there and starts talking about things need to change, he's very willing to pick up the governmental mallet to do so. And we've become so used to political campaigns wielding the political mallet of promise that we've kind of come to expect that it's not whether or not we need governmental reform or regulation, it's just which party's going to wield it. And I mean, I don't mean to get dramatic here. Obviously, that's dangerous, but quite honestly, it's just downright stupid. And that's frustrating because there's a lot of work to be done.
There really is. And RFK is such a walking contradiction on a lot of these things. I mean, he says that you should be a skeptic on so many of those big topics, that coming from the man who a couple of years ago suggested everyone skeptical on climate change should be imprisoned. He says that there's always a monetary there's always a monetary influence in those agencies, but actually fails to reveal in many of those podcast appearances that he used to sue all of these companies for money. He was a trial lawyer, so he would take big companies to court, pretend their products would create a health problem, and then because these were class action lawsuits, all of those funds that the big companies then would eventually pay out in their settlements, most of that would go to the law firms, meaning into his own pocket. So he did this for money for such a long time, and the whole premise of many of the theories that he puts out there is because he wanted to impress these juries. So somebody potentially going to a jury, like one of those trials in the future, would be impressed by what he says on the Joe Rogan podcast, and therefore would sway the court in one direction or the other. So he's been doing this as a career lawyer, and now he wants to make it into politics and policy. And I just don't see how it fits with a Trump administration that actually has a pretty positive track record on a lot of these things. When it comes to regulatory approvals, actually very reasonable. A lot of these, very drastic changes that you would have expected from these Trump appointees actually were pretty smart regulation. Things that actually worked out when it comes to tax reforms, when it comes to environmental policy. A lot of that was good in those 4 years, and it's not perfect. But somebody like RFK, he says that he wants to appoint activists to these agencies. And honestly, appointing RFK to the EPA in order to make it more independent, that would be like appointing Joe Biden as the speechwriter of Kamala Harris in order to give her speeches more clarity.
And that's exactly what I wanted to hit on. That's some of the stuff that I was looking up actually while you were kind of going into a little more detail on that last point. I really have an issue with individuals that believe that all we need in these governmental regulatory agencies are different employees. And in fact, you get into this very weird situation in which the private conversations you have with someone that you're friendly with end up getting into staffer positions that really they have no business being in that, staffing organization or that agency whatsoever. But this, to kind of bring it around full circle, this doesn't mean that I'm against, RFK Jr. endorsing Trump or endorsing whoever it is that he wants to. And by the way, it also doesn't mean that I disagree with some of his opinions on kind of like a chronic health crisis and some things about how the United States has kind of lowered its standards on a lot of things. But it's this idea that we have is because one person says things I like, that therefore they must be as good on the answers as my heroes or the political greats or whoever it is that you want making the policy. We give authority out so willingly because they agree with us. Kennedy's a really good example of why that's a bad idea. I'm glad Kennedy's out there campaigning for Trump. I'm glad Tulsi Gabbard's out there campaigning for Trump. But as a conservative, God forbid they actually get institutional power, because guess what? They're not. They're not conservatives. They're not libertarians. they're not. They may have been kicked out of the Democratic Party, but that doesn't automatically make them policy experts.
It does not. And what somebody like RFK tried to do is tear the trust in many of the institutions and resources that we use to get evidence-based policymaking, to get scientific knowledge, tries and tear it all down. And when you tear it all down and nobody trusts anyone and anything anymore, then that's not an ideology. Then you're just a full-time skeptic. And you're just like a French revolutionary toddler just trying to tear everything apart. Exactly, and that's not leading us anywhere. That is not conducive of a working economy. This is not how we can do industrial policy. If the U.S. wants to get back on track as to where it was in terms of trajectory, it needs trust in institutions and scientific institutions to do their job properly.
It really is an interesting concept to look at, for example, the difference between J.D. Vance and RFK Jr. RFK Jr. wanting to go in there and just kind of wreck through all of these agencies. Then there's also the free market wing of the Republican Party that doesn't really want agencies, especially trade commissions and things, with almost any regulatory power at all. And then you have J.D. Vance, who wants a very heavy-handed approach to the American industrial sector and policy. It's like three polar opposites of this bizarre political triangle that are all coming into this next administration. I don't think people realize how much discordance again, well, vastly preferable to Kamala Harris, there is going to be, as some of these policies are forced to reckon with one another.
Yes, and it is incumbent upon Donald Trump to give more clarity on these things. I mean, ultimately, all of these groups are trying to get his attention and trying to get his decision making, and he cannot allow himself the inconsistencies in what he presents to the American public, of trying to mingle all of those three together to get the extra votes. I think voters appreciate consistency, and this is the plan, not this is the next podcast where I can get more of an audience. It's like, this is the actual plan I'm trying to lay out here. This is a consistent model of my policy, and ultimately that is what he tried to do in his first term.
Right.
Let's see if he can get a second one based on the trust that he can actually deliver on policy. But if he gets pulled in every possible direction because he will just agree with the previous speaker at a rally, I think that's not conducive of a good candidate.
I agree. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit short on time. Bill Wirtz over from Consumer Choice. It's good to have you, as always. Take care, my man.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back in just a second. Don't go anywhere. This is the Tony Kinnett Cast on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and first on 93 WIBC.
Phones aren't working.